A woman feels conflicting emotions after the death of her husband. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today, it is Short Story Tuesday, so I want to talk about a very good short story that I read recently. One that kind of stands out amongst the others that I've been reading recently. And it's one that is about marriage and the thoughts you feel after someone you love dies. I am referring to The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, which was originally published in Vogue under the name The Dream of an Hour, but it was later published a year later in the St. Louis Voice or something like that. But it was published in 1894 and 1895. I've talked about Kate Chopin on this channel before when I talked about Desiree's Baby, which was a pretty good short story, one that I highly recommend you check out. I made a video on it, so be sure to look for that in my Short Story Tuesday playlist, or just look on my channel in the search bar. But for those who don't know, Kate Chopin was an Irish Creole American writer who wrote in the mid 1800s to early 1900s. She was known for writing about women in particular, which you see in Desiree's Baby, as well as the story that I'm talking about here. But these women were often viewed as liberated, or she talked about the oppression that women face in society, which often drew the ire of the men, the more conservative people who were like, you can't say that, you can't wish for women's liberation. Don't you know that won't happen for another 60 years or something like that? But people really thought that she was being indecent, among many other things. A very cool writer, one that I'm happy that I read more of her work. But without further ado, let's talk about The Story of an Hour. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Story of an Hour focuses on Louise Mallard. She is an old wife dealing with some heart disease. At the beginning of the story, she learns about the death of her husband in a railway accident. She immediately, she doesn't react with any sort of paralysis, the narrator notes, but she just starts crying, breaking down, holding her sister who told her very slowly so as to not affect her heart. And Louise is dealing with grief, and she chooses to go to her room and be alone for a time, which apparently takes place over the next hour. She reflects on these feelings of sadness, but she also begins to feel something come to her, which she realizes is a sense of freedom and liberation. No longer will she be living for somebody else, living under the thumb of another person, her husband in this case, but the years ahead will be for her. She'll get to do what she wants, and have more personal freedom in that sense. And she thinks, she still knows that she loves her husband, but that freedom is very entertaining to her. And so from here, her family's calling for her, and she goes downstairs. And when she gets down there, the door opens, and who should come in but Brentley, her husband, who, as it turns out, was nowhere near the railway accident that happened. And the people in the house try to stop her from seeing this, but seeing Brentley causes her to have a heart attack and die. And as the story comes to a close, the narrator notes that the doctors say that her cause of death is the joy that kills. They think that she was extremely happy to see her husband, and it gave her so much of a shock that it gave her a heart attack. But we kind of know, based on the writing, that was not true. And so that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there's a lot worth discussing in this story. Pretty shocking for what it was written, or pretty shocking for what was written at the time here, based on what was going on in America during this time period in which she was writing. I'll talk about that in a few moments, but one of the main things that Chopin is writing about here is a little bit about grief. Louise feels extreme sorrow at the passing of her husband. It's pretty fascinating how Chopin is writing that sadness, showing it coming in continued sobbing, just an outward expression of physical sorrow because someone you loved is no longer there. And you can see the state of her mind with her not doing too well, it causing a number of different things for her to think about. And what I really like about this is the sort of shocking pain and how realistic it feels. Because when my dad died, I felt a sense of extreme grief, just like an outward expression of sobbing and whatnot. It was very painful in that regard, which is what Louise seems to be going through in this story. And given, that was my dad and not exactly someone who I've loved for years and years and years, but, it still hurt. It still felt very, very much terrible and not good at all. Don't recommend it. But like for Kate Chopin to be able to accurately bubble that up and put it into her story, I'm rather amazed. So a lot of good work she's doing in talking about grief here. But grief is not the main focus of this story. Rather, it seems to be freedom and feminism. Those two things feel like they're deeply connected together in the story. Louise feels some joy about her newfound freedom. As soon as she's done feeling, or it's in tandem with the grief, but as soon as the time continues on in this sort of hour, she begins to realize what this means, that her husband is dead, that she will no longer be under the thumb of someone else, living for someone else. Allow me to read you a good quote from this. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in the brief moment of illumination, which is a fascinating quote from this, sort of getting at the feeling that, like, oh yes, I'm sad about this person dying, but also they kind of held me under their thumb. There was a sense of oppression that many other women of the time face, and to not have that, to not be bent to somebody else's will, to be able to do what you want in life, to live for yourself, it must feel like really, really good. And Chopin doesn't want you to get this wrong. There is love here. There is definitely a sense of love, because she did. But there was also that feeling of, this person annoyed me, this person made me feel bad, because they wanted to control me so much. And so she's no longer living for others or under the command of anyone else. And there's a good example of that, because in the story she's first introduced as Mrs. Mallard, which is interesting because you're introducing her as the wife of somebody else. She doesn't have her own identity. The first time we're made to meet her, like she's being introduced as the wife of Brentley. That's a good example of how there's no Louise, but after this death she'll be able to be Louise for herself. Which is very fascinating, because if you think about what was going on at the time, this was the Victorian era or the time of the Gilded Age, which women were trying to regain control in America, which I presume where the story is kind of taking place. But women didn't really have all that much power. Men could still assert control over them, which many women were fighting over. They were fighting for states' rights and the right to vote, and suffrage would happen, although it would be more focused on white women in the early 1900s. And so all of this is sort of represented in that story, that desire to be your own person and not be under the thumb, something that wouldn't be truly realized until the 1960s. But even then, it's still something that women are fighting for, because, in today's America, at least at the time that I'm talking, you have the fight for abortion rights. So men are once again trying to control women and prevent them from leading fulfilling whole lives. Unfortunately, in this story, that doesn't last long for Louise, because she goes downstairs and she sees Brentley again, and that brings all of this oppression, all of this control to her mind. There was that brief feeling of freedom coming her way. She sees her alive husband and knows this is all going to continue. She's not going to have what she wants. Maybe he'll even outlive her, and she won't have that freedom that she felt was promised to her. And so this, causes a heart attack, and she ends up dying. What's interesting is that she, like, the doctors say that it's the joy that kills. They believe that her death is a result of her seeing her husband and feeling intense joy. But we, the audience, know that's not true. She was upset, most likely, to a great extent, that she was no longer given that freedom, and it maybe broke her a little bit. It caused a heart attack from the already existing heart disease. And in that way, I do think that's a little bit of dramatic irony in this story, because the audience knows the real reason, but the characters do not. So I just find that fascinating. Again, it's very radical for its time, and I can understand why a lot of men were probably unhappy with what Kate Chopin was saying. They were arguing that, these women might not have truly loved them, and that the only reason they were hanging around men was because maybe there was some love, but there was also that feeling of being controlled, that men dominated in society and whatnot. So very fascinating what Chopin is saying here. I do want to draw some comparisons here to a couple of other stories, including Desiree's Baby, which Kate Chopin also wrote, a story where a woman gives birth to a black child, and she is blamed for it as a result, but we come to find out that the man had black ancestry, and that's where the genetic of the black baby in the story came from. But it represents how women have very little control over their own lives, and how they're blamed for many of the problems that happen. But it also reminds me of A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell, another writer who I would argue is a bit of a feminist. That story is like a woman like helping investigators try to figure out why a crime was committed, and she kind of figures out that it was due to the fact that her husband was oppressing her, was treating her poorly, killing things that she loved, and so like she can understand why that husband was murdered. But it's showing that, men oppressing women and the actions that they go to get that freedom back. And so there were a couple of different writers at the time who were writing things that would eventually lead to the, suffrage, and then the women's liberation movement of the 60s and continuing to today. So I would definitely argue that Chopin is way ahead of her time in what she's writing here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, a super great short story. Again, probably one of the best that I've read for this channel. I highly recommend that you go seek it out. I will put a link to it in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and have a conversation. It's definitely a very fascinating story, but you might all have a different insight into it, as I'm sure anyone might have. There's a lot that you could discuss here. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Kate Chopin or The Story of an Hour if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and women's liberation movements. Farewell.